What is horary astrology? Now, it's a form of divinatory astrology. And of course, you could say all astrology is divinatory, but I think we can make the argument that horary astrology is more divinatory than, I would say, most forms of astrology. It literally means of the hour in Greek, and it's just a symbolic method of divination that we do by interpreting a chart set for the time and place of the question. So with horary astrology, it's really a symbolic method of divination, obviously, and we interpret a chart set for the time and place of the question. Now, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs, you can really, any topic is open for query with a horary, right? But it doesn't mean that every question should be answered or that they're all suitable, right? Of course, you can have such a thing as questions that are a bit frivolous or that, maybe they're not very well thought out. Lots of reasons why, even though the horary chart will give you an answer and it'll give you the correct answer, it doesn't always mean that every question should be entertained and taken, with equal seriousness, right? So that's more up to the judgment of the astrologer, of course. Now, the other thing I would like to mention is that horary, as far as we know, really was a very major, if not the main form of astrology, I'm talking in antiquity, both due to, well, affordability. Obviously, it takes a lot less time to read a horary chart than, for example, a full natal chart, the speed of it, and also the lack of birth times for the majority of people. And so when you're looking at, for example, William Lilly's time, he was a major astrologer in the 17th century in England, you saw that most of his clients were in fact horary clients, and they would sort of sit out there in his waiting room and they'd come to see him for a 20-minute consultation, right? It was like going to the dentist or something like that. It was a very accessible, relatively affordable, and in some ways kind of a democratic form of astrology, whereas natal astrology might not have been available to everyone. So from these sort of very I would say auspicious times, horary has become much more of a niche area of astrology in the last few decades and really centuries. Now, of course, we've had a bit of a renaissance, but even then, we still don't have the same level of recognition for horary that we would have seen just a few centuries ago. That's just kind of the nature of it. People still don't know what it is. Clients are not going to come in for the most part expecting exactly what a horary consultation would be. Now, the number one principle of horary that I want to convey to you is that meaningful moments are not random. And I think this is something that can be very challenging for people, especially those of us who are modern people, to accept, is that how can you ask a question and then have the moment of that question reflect the situation so perfectly? Because then you start getting into interesting questions of predestination, right? Questions about how can my question match the moment? And of course, there isn't one known definitive answer for that, but nonetheless, it's something that makes you think about how the universe is put together. Now, of course, if you're familiar with Carl Jung, he talks about the concept of synchronicity, that different pieces of the universe move in unison based on a certain similarity or a certain likeness. But the thing to remember is that whenever you feel like you have sort of given your question thought, the medieval astrologer Guido Bonatti used to say that you should give every horary question, if you're the asker, a night and a day, as well as heartfelt prayer, right? To make sure that you've really sort of taken this into a sacred space and you've given it sufficient thought. Then you can be confident that you'll be asking your question at the appropriate time in such a way that the chart will reflect the reality of the situation. Now, I wanted to make sure that you're familiar with a few of the top names in horary, and this will help you not only become more informed, but if you want to pursue horary later, you'll know what names to look for, what texts to look for, that kind of thing. So here are some influential horary astrologers. This is a very partial list, but I thought these folks are worth mentioning. So chronologically, we've got Abu Masha'allah as well. These are two astrologers who primarily worked in Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries. And they're very important because they were both practicing astrologers, but they were also writers. They wrote texts that survive to this day, thanks to many intermediaries. And basically, they put together a lot of ideas for how to answer different kinds of questions. And so both Abu Mashar and Masha'Allah, they have texts that teach you, okay, if you have this kind of question, this is how you approach the chart, right? These are the factors you need to look for to have success or to see failure. Now, the next group of people who are the heirs of these medieval Arabic astrologers, or Perso-Arabic would be more accurate, are the medieval Europeans. And so this really starts with Guido Bonatti, who was an Italian 13th century author. He wrote a book called The Book of Astronomy, and it really contains everything about natal astrology, mundane astrology, and a fairly significant subsection on horary. That's really a book in itself. And in that text, he draws on a lot of these medieval texts. So again, he goes house by house, and he'll tell you, okay, if you have a second house question about money, here's how you answer these kinds of questions. Now, William Lilly is when we start getting into what we call the early modern era, and he practiced in England in the 17th century. He wrote a book called Christian Astrology. And the reason that William Lilly is so important is that he was the first author of an astrological text in English. There was one earlier, but it's a very partial text, and it was actually published in conjunction with another book. But this is certainly the first horary text that we have that was written, as far as we know, in English. And it's also very comprehensive because Lilly read and practiced all of the books that he could get his hands on. He was a very prolific reader in Latin. And so he kind of took this distillation of his practice and of his reading, and he put this all into Christian astrology, which is why that is such a useful book even today. Then in the 20th century, we have Olivia Berkeley, who practiced in England. And she was an author and teacher who was partially responsible for much of the revival of horary. She very much focused on Lilly, and she republished Christian astrology in, I want to say it was the 1970s or 1980s, so that people could read it for themselves. And this kind of spurred a renaissance of horary, if you will. Also in the 20th century, but here in Los Angeles, we had the astrologer Ivy Goldstein Jacobson, who wrote a number of self-published books, which are still circulating today. And even though she was not a traditionalist, she was also responsible for a lot of interest in horary, and she herself was clearly a very avid practitioner, even though some of her approaches are a little bit more idiosyncratic and unique than you would see kind of within the larger framework of the tradition. Okay, so before we go on, I wanted to do a chart with you really quick. So hopefully you're all poised at the questions box and you can give me some quick answers and thoughts. So here is a question. It's called, where is my swimming cap? And this is a question that I posed many, many years ago. And I wanted to share it with you because one, it's sort of, in some ways, it's the epitome of the frivolous question. I actually took a swimming cap that I owned and I had a friend hide somewhere in my house. And that sounds super frivolous, but it was a way for me to practice. And I wanted to show that horary really can answer every question, even though it may not necessarily need to be asked. But it's a great way to use horary to find hidden objects, to find objects that have been lost, and so on.